She looked at me with a trembling smile and whispered. "Don't leave me wondering tonight." In that moment, the line between neighbor and something far more dangerous began to blur. It was a late evening, the kind where the world feels hushed, as though it's holding its breath. I had stepped outside for no real reason, maybe to feel the coolness of the night air, maybe just to shake off the quiet restlessness that sometimes creeps in when you're alone. Across the short stretch of our shared fence, I noticed her. My neighbor's wife. She stood by her garden, hands brushing over the edges of a small row of jasmine plants. The porch light cast a soft golden glow across her face, catching in the strands of her hair as the breeze teased them loose. She looked older, yes, but not in a way that dulled her beauty. If anything, time had carved a kind of grace into her. I could have passed by with a wave, maybe a polite smile, and gone back inside. But she lifted her eyes, caught me standing there, and gave me a smile that lingered just long enough to make it feel personal. "Out late?" she asked, her voice warm but touched with a fatigue I couldn't quite name. I laughed softly. "Couldn't sleep. Thought some fresh air might help." Her gaze flickered over me, curious but guarded, and then she nodded. "I know the feeling." She pressed a hand lightly against her temple as if steadying a thought. "These days, sleep doesn't come easy." There was nothing dramatic about her words, nothing extraordinary about that exchange, and yet something in the way she said it, like a quiet confession slipped out by accident, made me step a little closer to the fence. I found myself studying the lines of her face, the subtle shadows beneath her eyes, the way she stood as though she carried more weight than anyone else could see. We spoke in fragments at first, about the night air, about how the jasmine was finally blooming, about how the neighborhood had grown so still. Yet every pause between us seemed to hum with something more. When she laughed, soft, low, a little self-conscious, her hand brushed against her own arm, as though she needed the grounding touch of her own skin. I didn't realize until that moment how much I was leaning in, not just to hear her, but to stay close to the sound of her voice. The scent of jasmine carried across the fence, mingling with the faintest trace of her perfume, something floral and understated. There was no reason for either of us to remain there, yet neither of us moved. Our words slowed, and silence filled the spaces like something deliberate, almost intimate. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes catching mine with a steadiness that felt heavier than it should have. For a breath, the night around us vanished. And then, almost too quietly, she said, "Sometimes it feels good, just to be seen." Her words lingered between us, heavier than the cool night air. I swallowed, not sure how to answer, but knowing I'd remember that single line long after I walked back inside. The following evening, I found myself hoping, maybe even expecting, to see her again. I told myself it was coincidence, but the truth was, I lingered outside longer than I needed to, leaning against the fence, pretending to be lost in thought. And sure enough, the porch light flickered on, and there she was. She carried a small mug in her hands, steam rising into the night air. The loose cardigan she wore draped over her shoulders as though it were holding her together. When she noticed me, she smiled, slightly hesitant, but real enough to pull me in again. "Back out here?" she asked. I nodded, chuckling softly. "Guess I'm starting to like the night more than the day." She tilted her head, considering that, then let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe that's because the night doesn't expect anything from you. It just lets you be." Something about the way she said it, like she wasn't just talking about the night, made me stay silent. Her eyes flickered down to her mug, and she took a slow sip, as though deciding whether to continue. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. "You know, people see me and they think I have everything together. A nice house, a family, a life that should feel full." She paused, her voice tightening around the edges. "But sometimes, it feels like I'm disappearing inside all of it. Like I'm part of the picture, but not really in it." Her honesty caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to open up, not like this, not to me. I searched her face, watching the way her lips pressed together after the words slipped out, as if she already regretted saying them. You don't seem invisible, I said gently. Not from where I'm standing. Her eyes lifted to mine then, sharp and searching, as if she wanted to believe me but wasn't sure she should. And then, almost with a rueful smile, she murmured, "That's because you're young. You still see things clearly." The way she said "young" was not dismissive, it was layered with something else. A recognition. Maybe even an ache. I shook my head, feeling something stir in me that I didn't want to name too quickly. Being young doesn't mean I can't understand. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Her hand shifted on the mug, fingers brushing lightly along the rim, but then, almost absent-mindedly, she reached out, letting her fingertips graze the edge of the fence between us. Just a small movement, but it sent a pulse through me. She laughed then, soft and self-aware, pulling her hand back to her side. "Listen to me," spilling my thoughts out on a quiet night. "You must think I sound ridiculous." "Not ridiculous," I said quickly. "Just, honest. And that's rare." Her expression softened. The smile she gave me wasn't the polite neighborly kind, it was something warmer, touched with gratitude. "Careful," she whispered. "If you keep saying things like that, I might get used to it." The night pressed in closer around us, filled with the hum of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves. And though the world was unchanged, I felt something shift quietly between us, as though her words had opened a door neither of us could easily close again. The third night, the air was cooler, carrying the kind of chill that made me tuck my hands into my pockets. I almost convinced myself not to linger, but the faint glow of her porch light drew me again like a moth to flame. She was there, standing with her arms folded as though the night had caught her unprepared. When she saw me, her smile warmed. "You'll catch a cold out here," she teased lightly. I shrugged. "Worth the risk." Her laugh was quiet, but it stayed with me. She hesitated then, eyes flickering toward the darkened street, then back to me. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "It's chilly. And, well, it's silly standing out here talking over a fence." For a heartbeat, I wondered if I'd misheard her. But the way she held the door open, waiting, left no doubt. I stepped across the short stretch of grass and into her world. Inside, her home felt different from the outside picture I'd always seen. It was warm, yes, but also filled with small signs of solitude, an unfinished book resting open on the coffee table, a blanket folded with meticulous care on the couch, framed family photos that somehow looked more like decorations than living memories. She motioned for me to sit while she disappeared briefly into the kitchen. I lowered myself onto the couch, the fabric soft but carrying the faint scent of lavender. The room was lit by a single lamp, its golden glow making everything feel softer, smaller. When she returned, she carried 2 cups, steam curling into the air. She handed one to me, and our fingers brushed, just barely, but the contact jolted me more than the heat of the tea itself. She must have felt it too, because she quickly looked away, sitting opposite me but close enough that our knees could have touched if either of us shifted just a little closer. We talked at first about nothing, how quiet the neighborhood was, how her children were always asleep by this hour, how tea always tasted better late at night. But beneath every word, I felt the unspoken pressing in, as though the real conversation was happening in the silences between us. At one point, she reached for the sugar, her hand passing mine. The backs of her fingers grazed against my knuckles, an innocent accident, yet her hand stilled for just a moment longer than it needed to before she drew it back. The air felt charged. My heartbeat was too loud in my ears, and yet I tried to steady myself, to focus on her words. She noticed, I think, because she smiled faintly, almost apologetically. "You must think I'm strange, keeping you here with small talk and tea." I shook my head, my voice lower than I intended. "No. I don't mind. I'd stay here all night if it meant hearing you talk." Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for the briefest second, the room seemed to narrow until only she and I existed in it. She didn't look away, not immediately. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between us, something fragile, but impossible to ignore. The tea had long gone cold, but neither of us moved to end the night. She sat with one leg tucked beneath her, the cardigan slipping slightly off her shoulder, though she didn't seem to notice. I sat across from her, trying to mask the pull I felt, the way every small gesture seemed to demand my attention. She had been telling me about her younger days, how she used to travel on impulse, how she once spent a summer sketching strangers in cafes just because it made her feel alive. Her voice softened as she spoke, a wistfulness wrapping around her words. I used to be braver, she said, her gaze drifting to the untouched mug in her hands. I didn't worry so much about what people thought. I just lived. I watched her closely, noticing the way her fingers traced the rim of the cup, slow and absent, as though her body carried the memory of things she couldn't say aloud. You don't seem afraid to me, I said quietly. Her eyes lifted, locking onto mine. For a long moment, she didn't blink, didn't look away. There was a steadiness in her gaze, but underneath it, I could see the faint tremor of vulnerability, like she wanted to believe me but wasn't sure she could. You're kind, she said at last, with a small, almost ironic smile. But kind eyes can be dangerous, too. Her words caught me off guard. Dangerous. The way she said it carried a weight that tightened the air between us. I felt my chest rise slowly as I tried to steady my breathing. The room seemed smaller now, the lamplight dimmer, the silence sharper. My knee brushed against hers beneath the table. It was so slight, it could have been an accident, but neither of us moved away. Instead, I felt the warmth of her linger there, subtle but undeniable. She leaned back slightly, exhaling through a half-laugh. I shouldn't be saying these things. I don't know why her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, looking down at her hands. You can say anything, I said, leaning forward without realizing it. With me, you don't have to hold back. Her shoulders rose and fell in a quiet breath. When she looked at me again, her eyes were softer, darker somehow. That's the problem, she whispered. My pulse quickened. I wanted to reach for her hand resting on the table, to bridge that last inch of space. But I held myself still, afraid of breaking the fragile balance between us. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, each second amplifying the closeness we shared. She glanced at it briefly, then back at me, her lips parting as though she were about to speak but then holding the words back. In that moment, I realized something had shifted. We were no longer two neighbors sharing late-night tea. We were two people standing at the edge of something neither of us had planned, but both of us felt pressing closer with every breath. The minutes stretched into something heavier than time, as if the night had folded itself around us. She sat quietly, her shoulders slightly turned toward me now, as though some invisible thread had pulled her closer. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, even across the small gap that still separated us. She broke the silence first. Do you ever wonder, she asked softly, what makes certain people see us, when others don't? Her words cut straight through me. I nodded slowly. All the time. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. More like relief. You make me feel seen, she whispered, almost like it was a secret she hadn't meant to let slip. The room felt smaller suddenly, wrapped in the low light of the lamp, the steady ticking of the clock fading beneath the sound of my own heartbeat. Her eyes stayed on mine, searching, waiting. And then, almost without realizing it, she shifted on the couch, closer. Just close enough that the fabric of her cardigan brushed lightly against my sleeve. I froze, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. Her presence filled every sense. The faint sweetness of her hair, the gentle perfume that clung to her sweater, the quiet tremble in her breath. Sometimes, she continued, her voice low, I feel like I've been living in silence. Like the world doesn't notice me anymore. And then you come along, and suddenly, she trailed off, shaking her head, as if words had failed her. I swallowed, my throat dry. Suddenly what? Her eyes flicked to my lips for the briefest second before returning to mine. Suddenly I remember what it feels like to be alive. The weight of her confession settled between us, heavy and undeniable. My hand rested on the couch cushion, close to hers. Without thinking, my fingers shifted, closer, closer still, until the back of my hand brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her palm up, letting her fingers lace lightly with mine. The warmth of her touch spread through me like fire, quiet but consuming. Her shoulders relaxed, and she leaned ever so slightly toward me, her voice trembling now. I shouldn't be saying this. I shouldn't, but the words faltered as her temple brushed against my shoulder, resting there for a moment as though it was the most natural thing in the world. My chest tightened with the sensation of her leaning into me, her cheek so close I could feel the steady rhythm of her breath. I wanted to wrap my arm around her, to draw her closer, but I held back, afraid of moving too quickly, of breaking the delicate thread of trust that hung between us. So I sat still, letting her stay, letting the silence speak louder than anything I could have said. And for the first time, it felt like she wasn't holding back anymore. The silence between us grew heavier, no longer empty but thick with something unsaid. She was still close, her shoulder pressed lightly against mine, her hand resting in my palm as if it had belonged there all along. I could feel the faint tremor of her fingers, the rise and fall of her breath. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes shimmering in the low light. For a moment, she simply held my gaze, and in that gaze was everything: loneliness, fear, longing, and something she seemed almost afraid to name. "I've forgotten what this feels like," she whispered, her voice so soft I had to lean in to catch it. To sit with someone and not feel invisible. I tightened my fingers gently around hers, not with possession, but with reassurance. "You're not invisible," I said quietly. "Not to me. Not ever." Her lips parted, trembling with words that hesitated on the edge of release. She let out a shaky breath, then gave a fragile smile. "You're young. You say that now, but one day you'll realize I'm just a woman holding on to pieces of herself." The sadness in her voice pulled at me. I shook my head. "No. You're more than that. I see you." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if the weight of those words settled deep inside her. And then, when she opened them again, something in her had shifted. The hesitation that had been holding her back began to crack. "Don't leave me wondering tonight," she said suddenly. The words hung in the air, fragile and electric. Her voice quivered on the last syllable, like she had bared a part of herself she couldn't take back. I didn't move. I just looked at her, absorbing every detail, the way her chest rose and fell a little too quickly, the nervous press of her lower lip between her teeth, the slight tremble in her hand even though it stayed firmly within mine. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound broke halfway. "I shouldn't have said that," she murmured, lowering her eyes. "You'll think I'm foolish." Gently, I reached out with my free hand and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. My fingertips lingered for a heartbeat longer than they should have, tucking the lock behind her ear. Her skin was warm beneath my touch, and she leaned into it ever so slightly, as though she'd been starving for something so simple. "I don't think you're foolish," I said softly. "I think you're brave." Her breath caught, and her eyes searched mine, desperate for truth. She gave the faintest nod, like she wanted to believe me, like she needed to. The night outside was silent, the world narrowed to just the two of us, her hand in mine, her words still echoing in the air, "Don't leave me wondering tonight." And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, nothing between us would ever feel the same again. Her words, "Don't leave me wondering tonight," still floated in the air between us, fragile but unshakable. I held her hand, feeling the faint tremor in her fingers, the pulse beneath her skin, steady yet vulnerable. For a moment, neither of us moved, as if the silence itself had become sacred. I wanted to close the space, to pull her fully into me, but more than that, I wanted to honor the weight of what she had entrusted me with. She wasn't asking for recklessness. She wasn't asking for promises I couldn't keep. She was asking not to be left alone with her ache, not to feel invisible again when the night ended. So instead of rushing forward, I lifted her hand gently, pressing it between both of mine. She looked at me, eyes shimmering with unshed emotion, and the faintest smile tugged at her lips. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "Just, don't disappear." I shook my head slowly, keeping my voice low. "I'm not going anywhere." Her shoulders softened, as though the weight she carried had finally loosened. She shifted closer, the cardigan brushing against my arm, and then, without asking, she leaned into me. Her cheek rested lightly against my chest, her breath steady but shallow at first. I wrapped an arm around her, letting my hand rest gently along her back, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. The embrace wasn't hurried. It was slow, unspoken, almost timeless. The kind of closeness that said more than words ever could. I felt the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat through the thin layers of fabric, each beat syncing with my own in a way that felt both grounding and surreal. "You feel steady," she murmured after a long silence, her voice muffled against me. I smiled faintly, lowering my chin just enough that my lips brushed against her hair. "And you don't?" She gave a small laugh, fragile, but real. "Not until now." We stayed like that, letting the minutes pass unnoticed. The world outside could have ended, and I don't think either of us would have cared. She belonged to that moment, and so did I. When she finally pulled back, it wasn't with distance, but with gentleness. Her eyes met mine again, softer now, no longer clouded by the same uncertainty. She cupped my hand with both of hers, as though sealing a silent promise neither of us had the courage, or need, to put into words. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" I asked. "For not leaving me wondering." Her words sank into me, warm and permanent. I smiled, squeezing her hand lightly before letting the silence close around us again. There was no need for grand declarations, no rush into something undefined. What mattered was this: she wasn't invisible tonight, and I wasn't alone. The night ended not with fireworks, but with something far rarer, an intimacy born from honesty, a closeness that wrapped itself around us like the steady hush of the world outside. And as I finally rose to leave, I carried the warmth of her touch with me, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, this night would remain etched between us. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment that made you feel truly seen? Your stories mean as much here as mine do.